History remembers emperors for their victories, but some are remembered for their obsessions. In the decaying twilight of Byzantium, when faith faltered and empires crumbled, one man surrendered his throne not to war, but to love. His name was Alexios V, the last flame of a dying dynasty, whose heart was captured by a Thracian slave named Lyra. What began as desire would become a plague, consuming a ruler, a woman, and an empire itself. In the final century of Byzantium's fading glory, Emperor Alexios V Komnenos ruled over a city that shimmered like gold by day and bled like rust by night. Constantinople was still a miracle of marble and mosaics, but hunger gnawed at its edges. The empire's wealth had been drained by decades of foreign tribute, and its people looked to the emperor for salvation. Yet behind the jeweled doors of the great palace, salvation was the last thing on his mind. Alexios had inherited the throne at 28, a scholar, a reformer, and a man burdened by the ghosts of emperors past. For the first years of his reign, he ruled with reason and restraint. Then, one spring morning, during a slave auction outside the Forum of Constantine, he saw her. The girl stood apart from the others, a Thracian no older than 18, with pale eyes that did not plead. Her silence disturbed him more than the cries of the chained men around her. When the auctioneer raised his staff to mark the price, Alexios intervened. He purchased her himself, shocking the court. Her name was Lyra, though she had not spoken it aloud in months. No one knew what crimes or tragedies had brought her to the capital. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had once been free. The emperor placed her among the attendants of his private quarters, but it was not long before she became more than a servant. At first, his attraction was tempered by fascination, an intellectual curiosity about her stillness, her refusal to beg or flatter. He asked her questions. She answered rarely. When she did, her words carried a strange wisdom that unsettled him. In her presence, he forgot the empire's debts, the quarrels of the Senate, the starvation in the streets. His advisors called it indulgence. He called it clarity. Weeks became months. The Thracian slave became his muse, then his solace, then his obsession. He ordered her to be tutored in Greek, dressed her in silks once worn by queens, and gave her chambers that overlooked the Bosporus. The courtiers whispered, but Alexios ignored them. To him, she was not a concubine. She was the embodiment of his empire, fragile, wounded, yet breathtakingly beautiful. It was said that Lyra sang once a low, mournful melody in her native tongue, and the emperor wept before his attendants. That night, he commanded her chains to be struck from her ankles. In his proclamation, he declared her free by imperial grace. But freedom in Byzantium was never without cost. From that night forward, a shadow passed over the palace. Ministers began to fear entering the emperor's chambers, for his moods shifted like storms. He would appear before the Senate distracted, eyes distant, muttering of dreams and voices. Lyra rarely left his side. The chroniclers of that age later wrote that it was not the armies of the Turks, nor the greed of merchants, that doomed Byzantium. It was the day an emperor looked upon a slave and mistook desire for destiny. And though no one dared speak it aloud, the empire began to rot from within the very hour she first smiled at him. By the following winter, the great palace of Constantinople no longer hummed with politics, but whispered with scandal. Courtiers who once debated military reforms now discussed the emperor's nightly visits to the slave's chamber. They spoke in shadows behind veiled columns and marble saints, for even the walls seemed to listen. The emperor's fascination with Lyra had become the empire's most dangerous secret, one everyone knew, yet no one dared to name. The Empress Dowager, Alexios's mother, withdrew from the court entirely. The patriarch's sermons began to carry thinly veiled warnings against lust and idolatry. Yet each word of condemnation only seemed to strengthen Alexios's defiance. He appeared in the council hall with Lyra standing silently behind his throne, her eyes lowered, her expression unreadable. To the nobles, she was a ghost wearing silks. To the emperor, she was proof that he ruled by love, not law. The senators called her the Thracian enchantress. The soldiers, less poetic, whispered that she had cursed the emperor's mind. Ministers who expressed concern began to vanish. One was found drowned in the cistern beneath the Blisarni palace, another exiled to a monastery far beyond the capital. Each disappearance deepened the silence. No one dared question the emperor again. Behind the gilded doors of the imperial chambers, Lyra's voice was calm, measured like a physician diagnosing a fever. She warned Alexios that the Senate plotted against him, that the patriarch coveted his throne through faith. Whether she spoke truth or poison, no one could tell. But in her company, the emperor began to see treachery in every kind word, rebellion in every bowed head. He started replacing the old guard of noble-born advisors with low-born, men loyal only to him, men who owed their fortunes to his favor, and, through it, to Lyra. The empire's council transformed into a circle of trembling sycophants, each more fearful than the last. Policy gave way to paranoia. Even the city itself began to change. Where once artisans carved icons of saints, they now sculpted likenesses of the emperor and his mysterious consort. Gold that might have repaired ships or fed the hungry was spent on mosaics depicting Lyra's face upon the palace walls. The people saw and murmured, "A slave sits in the empress's seat while the poor starve." The patriarch attempted to intervene, requesting a private audience with Alexios. But the emperor received him coldly, Lyra at his side, her eyes reflecting the torchlight like polished glass. When the patriarch implored him to repent his unholy affection, Alexios smiled faintly and said, "Love cannot offend heaven." The old man left the palace trembling, certain that the empire's soul had already been lost. At night, the city grew quieter. The chimes of evening prayers were drowned by the sound of soldiers' boots patrolling the streets. Alexios's new order, sworn to guard the palace from traitors. The nobles no longer dined together, afraid to be overheard. Fear had become the empire's new currency. Lyra rarely spoke in public, yet her presence was everywhere, in every decree, every punishment, every whisper that passed through the palace. She was both invisible and omnipresent, like a rumor that could not die. And though the chronicles describe this time with caution, one thing was clear even to the scribes: by loving her, the emperor had declared war, not against enemies beyond his walls, but against the very heart of his own empire. By the second year of Lyra's reign within the emperor's heart, Byzantium had grown quieter, not with peace, but with fear. The court's laughter had turned to murmurs. The Senate chamber echoed with silence. Where once stood proud men of lineage and learning, now lingered shadows of obedience. Yet beneath that silence, resentment festered like rot beneath marble. The nobles could not accept that their sovereign knelt before a former slave. Their disgust disguised itself as patriotism. Behind the incense and piety of their banquets, secret alliances began to form, letters written in code, promises sworn over wine. They spoke of restoring order, of freeing the emperor from the witch's spell. But Lyra heard every word long before it reached his ears. It was said that a servant loyal to her uncovered the first plot, a midnight meeting between General Petronus, commander of the imperial guard, and two senators. Their betrayal was certain, yet no trial was called. The next morning, the emperor summoned them to the hippodrome for a demonstration of imperial mercy. The square filled with citizens eager for spectacle. The condemned men were brought forth, bound but unbowed. General Petronus dared to shout that he died for Byzantium, not against it. Alexios stood above him, draped in imperial purple, Lyra at his side veiled in white. The emperor's voice carried across the crowd. Let the empire witness the cleansing of its veins. The crowd gasped as iron spikes were raised. The punishment, impalement, was one reserved for traitors and rebels, never for noble blood. Yet Alexios watched without blinking as the spears pierced flesh and the screams rose into the spring air. Lyra did not flinch. When it was done, she merely lowered her eyes, whispering something only the emperor could hear. That evening, the city was struck dumb. No bells tolled, no songs were sung. The citizens walked faster past the hippodrome, where 3 bodies hung against the skyline. Their deaths marked not justice, but transformation, the moment when fear became the empire's law. In the days that followed, Alexios issued new decrees. The Senate's powers were curtailed. Noble estates seized for the security of the realm. Old families were stripped of titles. Their daughters sent to convents, their sons drafted into the frontier legions. The throne's enemies were not merely defeated, they were erased. Lyra's influence was no longer hidden. She was now seen attending councils, her voice soft yet decisive. Her beauty had become an emblem of terror, the symbol of a new Byzantium where loyalty was measured in silence. The patriarch pleaded again for restraint, warning that no empire could survive on blood alone. But Alexios dismissed him with a single line: "Blood built Rome. Blood will preserve Byzantium." As the executions multiplied, so did the unease within the palace. Servants vanished overnight. Ministers smiled through trembling lips. Even the marble corridors seemed colder, as if the stones themselves recoiled from what they had witnessed. And through it all, Lyra remained beside the emperor, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. Some said she had bewitched him. Others whispered that she simply reflected his true nature, stripping away the last mask of civility. When the bodies of the executed nobles were finally taken down, the vultures had already done their work. The people said it was an omen, that Byzantium's flesh was being eaten by its own crown. From that day forward, none could tell where the emperor's will ended and the slaves began. Together, they had rewritten mercy into madness, and Byzantium into a kingdom ruled not by faith or law, but by desire. By the 3rd year of Alexios's reign of obsession, the empire had become a mirror of its ruler, brilliant on the surface, broken beneath. Constantinople still glittered with domes and marble, but its streets groaned with hunger. The nobles no longer held council. Their palaces stood shuttered and silent. The merchants paid tribute to the emperor's whims, and priests whispered prayers for deliverance from their own sovereign. Amid this decay, a new figure rose beside the emperor's throne, the Thracian slave, now dressed not in linen but in woven gold. Lyra's face appeared on coins, her likeness carved beside that of Alexios in mosaic. The court chroniclers were ordered to record her lineage as divinely appointed, though none could trace it beyond her chains. Then came the coronation. It began as rumor that Alexios intended to make Lyra his empress in defiance of both law and faith. The announcement struck like thunder across the capital. The Senate begged him to reconsider, warning of rebellion. The patriarch declared such an act a blasphemy against heaven itself. Even the army murmured, for never in the history of Byzantium had a woman of bondage been crowned beside the basileus. But the emperor no longer listened to counsel. He claimed that Lyra had been chosen by divine vision, that her spirit had been touched by the archangel himself. When the patriarch refused to officiate the ceremony, Alexios replaced him with a lesser cleric, promising eternal salvation in exchange for obedience. On a cold morning, the bells of Hagia Sophia rang hollow over the city. Beneath its vast dome, the emperor placed the crown of Byzantium upon Lyra's head. The air trembled with incense and disbelief. Some nobles fainted. Others fled. And when the final hymn was sung, half the congregation had already slipped away, unwilling to bear witness to sacrilege. Outside the cathedral, the people gathered in silence. The newly crowned empress appeared at the balcony, her hand resting lightly upon Alexios's arm. She did not smile. Her eyes swept over the city, the broken roofs, the starving beggars, the smoke from the dying market stalls. To the commoners, she was neither angel nor demon, only a stranger wearing the crown that belonged to their ruin. Within days, riots began. Churches were vandalized by mobs chanting that God had abandoned them. Monks fled their monasteries, fearing the emperor's wrath. In the ports, merchants refused to trade Byzantine coin, claiming it carried the curse of the slave queen. But in the palace, the emperor seemed untouched by turmoil. He built Lyra new chambers of marble and rosewood, filled with perfumes from Persia and jewels from distant India. He declared a week-long festival of her reign, even as famine spread through the outer districts. Each night, from his window, he would look upon the torchlit riots and whisper to her, "Let them burn, if they must. I have you." Yet not all burned in worship. Some burned in rage. For the first time in centuries, the empire's holy men began to call the emperor by another name, the apostate of love, and as the fires of revolt lit the edges of the city, the courtiers began to wonder, had Byzantium been crowned anew, or buried alive beneath the crown of a slave? The palace had grown quieter since the coronation, not with peace, but with fear. Servants spoke in whispers, avoiding the eyes of their rulers. Courtiers learned to smile while trembling. Every gilded corridor seemed to echo with invisible footsteps, as if ghosts had taken residence in the empire's heart. Lyra, now empress, moved through this silence like a shadow wrapped in silk. Her beauty no longer seemed human. It had become a reflection of something darker, sharper. The same voice that once soothed Alexios now began to shape his nightmares. She would sit beside him in the evenings, her hands tracing the veins on his wrists, and whisper, "They despise me because they envy what I am to you." At first, Alexios dismissed her fears, but the thought rooted itself deep within him. He began to see danger in every bow, treachery in every prayer. When ministers spoke of famine, he heard only rebellion. When generals knelt before him, he wondered if their loyalty was to the crown or to her. Lyra knew the art of silence better than words. She let him drown in his own imagination. Each night, she spoke of half-truths, of letters stolen, of nobles who dined together too often, of whispers she accidentally overheard. She never accused, merely suggested. The poison worked better that way. Soon, the emperor stopped attending council. He dismissed his most trusted advisor for a rumor that began in Lyra's chamber. The great halls once filled with laughter now echoed with his pacing steps and broken murmurs. In the nights, sleep abandoned him. He began to see shapes in the corners, silhouettes of monks and ministers long dead. The candles burned until morning, casting distorted reflections across the walls. Sometimes he would wake to find Lyra watching him, her gaze unreadable, her voice soft as dust. "Do not let them take what we built." The emperor's reflection became his enemy. He ordered the mirrors in the palace covered, but Lyra kept one, a tall Venetian glass that stood in her private chamber. There, she would force him to look upon his face. "Do you see them?" she would whisper. "The traitors who hide in your eyes?" In the reflection, Alexios began to see not himself, but the empire, bleeding, whispering, accusing. His mind fractured into the thousand faces of those he feared. Soon, decrees of execution became daily rituals. Nobles vanished without trial, guards disappeared after hesitation, and even priests who prayed for mercy were branded conspirators. Constantinople wept, but no one dared speak aloud. The chroniclers later wrote that the emperor began keeping a journal of divine commands. Each page was filled with frantic orders written in his own trembling hand. Always ending the same way, Lyra sees clearly. "I must obey." By the winter of that year, the palace had become a mausoleum of fear. Its golden walls trapped the emperor inside a dream he could no longer control. Lyra watched the ruin unfold, not with satisfaction, but with the calm inevitability of fate. Sometimes she would sit beside him and whisper prayers that sounded more like spells. "Let them fear you," she said one night, her lips close to his ear. "Only fear can make love eternal." The emperor looked at her then, his eyes hollow and glistening. "And if they fear me too much?" he asked. Lyra smiled faintly. "Then they will remember you forever." Outside, the city bells tolled for another death, and inside the mirrored palace, Byzantium's greatest ruler vanished into his own reflection. Spring returned to Constantinople, but no one celebrated its arrival. The streets were quiet, the markets half empty, the priests cautious with every sermon. Yet within the golden halls of the palace, the emperor prepared a spectacle, a feast so magnificent it would silence doubt and drown dissent beneath silk and music. He called it the Feast of Renewal. The people called it the Banquet of Blood. For weeks the kitchens labored day and night. Peacocks were roasted and dressed in their feathers, honeyed lambs glazed with cinnamon and wine. Servants carried amphorae of Persian pomegranate liquor, and golden goblets were set for every noble in the court. The invitations bore the emperor's personal seal. To refuse was treason, to attend was terror. When the night came, the imperial hall gleamed like a temple of sin. Columns were wrapped in crimson silk, torches burned with perfumed oil, and musicians played soft hymns twisted into melodies of desire. At the center sat Lyra, her dress woven from violet thread and pearls that shimmered like tears. The emperor beside her wore a crown heavier than his sanity. One by one, the nobles entered, their faces pale beneath layers of powdered grace. They bowed, smiled, and trembled. The air was thick with incense and fear. Alexios rose and lifted his goblet. "Tonight," he declared, "we celebrate loyalty, the bond that holds our empire together." The words echoed like a prayer, though everyone knew it was a threat. As courses passed, the music grew louder. Dancers appeared, not courtiers, but slaves, their wrists chained with gold, their bodies painted with the symbols of the empire. They moved in rhythm to drums that mimicked the heartbeat of war. Some guests clapped weakly. Others looked away. Then came the poisoned wine. It was said that Lyra herself had chosen which cups to fill. No one saw her do it, yet every servant seemed to know. When the final toast was raised, the emperor's smile was serene, almost merciful. "To the empire that bleeds for beauty," he said, "and to the goddess who guards it." They drank. The hall fell silent. Then, slowly, the sound of choking began. One, then another. The laughter collapsed into gasps. Silver goblets spilled across marble as bodies trembled on the floor. Through it all, Lyra did not move. Her gaze remained fixed upon the emperor, her expression unreadable, neither horror nor joy, only inevitability. When the last body stilled, Alexios turned to her and spoke softly. "You see, my love, they feared us. Now they worship." He rose from his throne and took her hand, leading her to stand beside him. The musicians, terrified, continued to play as the emperor proclaimed before the corpses, "Behold Lyra, the living goddess of the empire. Flesh of heaven, spirit of flame." The surviving courtiers bowed, not out of devotion, but out of the pure instinct to survive. Outside the palace, the news spread like plague. The markets closed, the monasteries barred their gates, and the harbor filled with fleeing ships. That night, the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled without command, mourning a city that could no longer pray. When dawn came, the torches of the feast still burned. The smell of spiced meat and death mingled in the air. The throne room glowed crimson beneath the morning light, a cathedral to madness where the sacred and the profane had finally become one. By the next evening, the people had given the empress a new name whispered in alleys and churches alike, the Scarlet Saint of Sin, and Byzantium, cursed by its own devotion, began to rot from the heart outward. The smoke of the feast had barely faded when the Patriarch of Constantinople rose against the emperor. From the pulpit of Hagia Sophia, his voice thundered through the sanctuaries, condemning Lyra as the scarlet harlot and Alexios as a man who had traded God for lust. He warned that the empire had become a brothel of idols, its throne corrupted by sin. It was the first open defiance in years. When word reached the palace, Alexios listened in silence. His eyes, once sharp, now haunted, stared through the chamber window toward the golden dome glinting in the distance. Lyra stood beside him, her fingers trailing along his arm like a whisper of possession. "They call you mad," she said softly. "Will you let them?" Her tone was not anger. It was invitation. By nightfall, the orders were written. The emperor's soldiers stormed the churches, first the monasteries near the Mezi, then the shrines of the saints. They tore the holy icons from their frames and piled them high in the squares. The images of Christ, the Virgin, and the martyrs were cast into the flames. The air filled with the scent of burning oil and pigment, of faith dissolving into smoke. The patriarch was dragged from the altar. When he refused to bow before the empress, his eyes were gouged and his body left hanging before the doors of the great church. The emperor's decree called it the cleansing of heresy, but the people called it the night God turned away. Lyra watched from the palace balcony as the fires spread across the city. She wore a veil of gold thread, the glow of the inferno reflecting in her eyes. "Now they see truth," she murmured. "Faith is only loyal to power." Yet somewhere within her words was sorrow, not for the dead, but for what she had become. Alexios descended deeper into madness. He demanded new paintings, portraits of Lyra in angelic robes, seated upon clouds, crowned with light. The finest artisans were forced to destroy their old works and replace them with her likeness. In every hall, her eyes followed him, soft and divine, whispering that the empire's salvation lay in her beauty alone. Those who resisted vanished. Monks who hid relics were crucified along the Bosporus walls. Libraries were burned, entire histories turned to ash. One chronicler wrote, before his execution, "The emperor fears not God, for he has made one of his own." And still, the fires burned. For 7 nights, Constantinople glowed red against the sea. Fishermen claimed they could see the city aflame from miles away, a second sun rising from the waters. Mothers covered their children's eyes when soldiers passed, their armor reflecting the inferno like polished mirrors of judgment. By the 8th day, nothing sacred remained. The emperor declared a new faith, a divine union between ruler and goddess. Lyra was named She Who Breathes Light. Processions were held in her honor, where citizens were forced to kneel as her image was carried through the streets. But the light she brought was the color of blood. In the quiet that followed, Constantinople lay smothered beneath its own ashes. The bells of the churches had melted. The chants of prayer were replaced by the silence of fear. From her throne, Lyra watched the empire kneel, not to faith nor love, but to the reflection of its own corruption. And as the embers dimmed, even she began to wonder whether she had birthed a god or a monster. The fires that had devoured Constantinople's icons left behind a city of ash and whispers. Smoke still clung to the marble colonnades, and the wind carried the scent of burnt incense and death. Inside the great palace, however, the world had become eerily silent, a silence that made even the servants tremble. Alexios no longer held councils. His throne room had become a mausoleum of fear, draped in veils embroidered with Lyra's likeness. Each evening, he summoned her musicians to play until dawn, songs of devotion, of divine love, of eternal loyalty. But Lyra, once enthralled by his adoration, now felt only exhaustion. She had become an idol carved from guilt. The people hated her. The clergy cursed her name in secret. Even the palace guards avoided her gaze, fearing it might condemn them. And yet, the emperor worshipped her still. Every glance, every breath, every word she spoke became law. But within Lyra, something began to fracture. The woman who had once been a slave remembered freedom, the sound of rain on Thracian fields, the laughter of youth before chains and crowns. Now she lived in a golden cage, worshipped by a mad god. It was then that she met him, a young courtier named Dorian, a scribe assigned to record the decrees of the emperor. He was gentle, with eyes untainted by power. When he bowed before her, he did so not out of fear, but reverence, the kind reserved for something human, not divine. Their encounters were brief, whispered exchanges between columns and moonlight. At first, she resisted him, terrified of her own longing. But loneliness is its own kind of hunger. And so one night, beneath the silk canopy of the emperor's bedchamber, while Alexios wandered through his dreams of blood and sanctity, she gave in. The sin was not of the flesh alone, but of the soul. For the first time in years, Lyra felt alive. Dorian spoke of escape, of fleeing across the sea to lands untouched by empire. She listened, trembling between terror and hope. Yet deep down she knew, Byzantium did not release its ghosts. Their secret did not remain hidden long. The palace had eyes everywhere, servants, priests, eunuchs loyal to the emperor's paranoia. One saw her hand brush against Dorian's in the torchlight and fled to report it. When Alexios was told, he did not speak. He merely rose from his throne and walked barefoot to her chamber. The night was still, save for the faint hum of prayers in the courtyard. There, upon the golden bed they had shared since her coronation, he found her trembling beside the young man. He smiled. No one knows what words passed between them, only that by dawn, Dorian's screams echoed through every corridor. His skin was peeled from his body, hung upon iron hooks outside Lyra's door, a gift of devotion. Beneath it, the emperor placed a plaque inscribed, "So dies the betrayer of gods." Lyra collapsed beside the blood-stained bed, her tears falling upon the sheets where love had become torment. She no longer looked divine. She looked human again, broken, small, and haunted. That night, the emperor sat beside her, his face calm and pale. "You are all I have left," he whispered. "Even your sin is mine." Outside, the sea wind carried the scent of death through the palace gardens. And within the heart of Byzantium, the empire's last remnants of sanity bled quietly into the dawn. The palace never slept again after Dorian's death. Even the walls seemed to breathe with unease, as though the marble itself recoiled from what had been done. Servants whispered of shadows that moved without torchlight, of the faint cries that echoed near the imperial chambers long after midnight. Alexios walked those halls barefoot, dressed in a robe once white but now stained with red wine and candle soot. His hair hung uncombed, his eyes hollow yet alive with feverish light. He had ceased to eat, to rule, or to pray. Instead, he wandered, searching, listening, as if the ghosts of the palace had begun to speak. They had. At first, it was only faint murmurs, a rustling in the corners, a sigh carried through the corridors. But soon the voices took shape, the generals he had executed, the monks burned for heresy, the patriarch blinded for defiance. They whispered to him from the baths, from the cisterns beneath the city, from the reflection of the moon in the marble floors. "Cleanse the blood," they urged. "Wash away the sin." He obeyed. Every night, he descended into the imperial baths, once the pride of Byzantium, now reeking of decay. The attendants were forbidden to enter. There, alone with the steam and his madness, he spoke to the dead. He confessed, begged, and cursed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Lyra would wake to find him gone, his bed cold, his footsteps leading down into the undercroft. When she tried to follow, the guards stopped her. "By his command," they murmured. The emperor had begun a new kind of purification. Those who had witnessed the execution of Dorian were summoned, one by one, to the baths. None returned. At dawn, the attendants would find the water cloudy and pink. By the fifth night, it ran red as garnet. The drains beneath the palace carried that color into the cisterns that fed the city. Constantinople awoke to fountains that bled. Panic swept the streets. The people called it a curse, the vengeance of saints for the burning of their icons. But within the palace, Alexios smiled. "The empire is washing itself," he said. "Soon it will be clean again." Lyra no longer recognized him. His love had become something monstrous, a devotion turned inward, feeding on the ghosts of guilt and faith. When she tried to speak, he silenced her with tenderness, a finger upon her lips, a trembling hand brushing her cheek. "Do not fear me," he whispered. "You are my salvation." But his eyes betrayed the truth. He saw her not as his love, but as the last idol left to destroy. That night, as the city below trembled in fear, Lyra crept through the corridors she once ruled. The marble floors, slick with condensation, mirrored her reflection, pale, hollow, crowned in sorrow. From beyond the doors of the baths came the low hum of chanting, though no choir remained. She peered inside. The emperor knelt before the steaming pool, surrounded by the bodies of his servants, pale, floating, their eyes open and glassy. In his hands he held the imperial scepter, its tip dipped in crimson water. When he looked up at her, his smile was calm, almost tender. "Look, my love," he said. "They are baptized." Lyra fled. Behind her, the sound of splashing echoed like a hymn to madness. And by dawn, the waters of Byzantium ran red, not from war, but from a single man's attempt to cleanse his soul through the drowning of his empire. The empire that once gleamed like gold had turned to rust. Across the provinces, fires burned where loyalty once stood. The generals who had survived Alexios's purges now marched under banners of rebellion. The soldiers who once chanted his name in triumph now cursed it in hunger. By spring, Constantinople was surrounded. From the palace walls, the empress could see the smoke rising from the outer districts, the markets, the temples, even the aqueducts. The city's heart bled slowly, choked by famine and despair. The people who had once thrown roses before the emperor's carriage now hurled stones at his soldiers. Inside the great palace, silence reigned. Lyra moved through its corridors like a ghost, her once radiant silks replaced by mourning veils. She no longer wore jewels. Their gleam reminded her of the screams that haunted the halls. The musicians had fled, the priests were gone, and only the echo of footsteps filled the imperial chambers. Alexios had locked himself within the throne room. There, he sat alone beneath the violet banners of Byzantium, his crown resting beside him on the cold marble floor. The walls, once adorned with icons and frescoes, were bare, burned or torn by his own hand. He spoke little now. His eyes wandered between the open doors and the horizon, where the fires of the rebellion flickered like distant stars. Lyra came to him one evening as thunder rolled over the Bosporus. Her voice trembled as she knelt beside him. "We can still flee," she whispered. "There are ships waiting at the harbor. We can start anew, somewhere far from here." But Alexios only smiled, faint and tired. "Flee, and leave the ghosts behind to reign in my stead." He reached for her hand. "No, Lyra, we built this kingdom from sin. It must die with us." Outside, the gates of the palace thundered beneath the blows of the mob. The clamor grew louder with every heartbeat, the crash of iron, the roars of betrayal, the chant of vengeance echoing through the gardens. Lyra clutched him tighter. "They will kill us," she cried. He turned toward her then, his face pale, serene, almost holy. "No," he said softly. "They will never have us." From beneath his robes he produced a small golden vial, engraved with the imperial seal. "Poison," he said, "distilled from the lily of Thrace. It kills without pain." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but she did not resist. The sound of the mob was now at the gates, the roar of the city collapsing upon itself. She could feel the walls tremble beneath her feet, the pulse of Byzantium's dying heart. They sat together upon the golden bed, the same bed where passion had turned to tyranny, where love had birthed madness. Alexios poured 2 goblets of wine, crimson as blood, and mixed the poison within. He raised his cup, his gaze never leaving hers. "To the empire," he murmured, "and to the sin it could not contain." Their lips met once more, a kiss heavy with sorrow, memory, and ruin. When the mob finally broke through, they found the palace empty of sound. The golden bed gleamed beneath the light of the torches. Upon it lay the emperor and the woman who had remade a world, their hands entwined, the cups fallen beside them, the faintest smile still lingering upon their faces. Outside, the violet banners of Byzantium fell, one by one, into the flames. And the empire, once the jewel of the world, collapsed not from war or conquest, but from love. When dawn rose over Constantinople, the light fell upon a city unrecognizable. Smoke curled from the ruins of its churches. The scent of charred marble and blood lingered over the Bosporus. The empire that had once called itself eternal now lay in silence, broken, looted, and hollow. The soldiers who stormed the great palace expected treasure. What they found instead was a tomb. The throne room stood still, bathed in the dull light of morning. The banners of Byzantium hung torn and colorless. The violet silk of the emperor's standard, once shimmering with imperial pride, now sagged in ash. Upon the marble dais, 2 figures rested side by side. The emperor's crown lay between them, its jewels darkened by soot. Alexios's hand still clasped Lyra's, a gesture so intimate that even the hardened rebels paused in their march. There was no sign of struggle, only the 2 cups beside the bed, tipped and empty, and the faint scent of lily in the air. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, crossed himself and whispered, "May God forgive them." But no priest came to bless their remains. The patriarchate, rebuilt by the victors, declared them heretics. The chroniclers of the new regime were forbidden to write their names. Their portraits were dragged through the streets and burned. The few that survived were defaced, their faces scratched out, their eyes gouged by knives. And so, the emperor who dreamed of divine love was erased from history. The empress who rose from chains to crown was condemned to oblivion. Yet history has its own way of remembering. In the years that followed, rumors spread among the city's survivors. The fishermen who sailed near the ruined sea walls claimed they saw lights flickering in the palace at night, faint glows like candles in the emperor's chamber, though no one had lived there for decades. Monks who passed the grounds heard faint voices in the wind, a man whispering a woman's name, over and over, in the stillness before dawn. Lyra, they said the palace itself mourned them. When the next emperor rose, he ordered the great palace sealed. Its doors were locked with iron chains, its gardens left to rot beneath ivy and dust. No one dared rebuild there. Even the birds avoided the high towers where Alexios once stood to watch the sea. Centuries later, when the empire itself finally crumbled, the ruins of that palace were unearthed. Among the fragments of mosaics and marble, scholars found traces of frescoes hidden beneath soot, faded images of a woman crowned with light, standing beside a man whose gaze was both tender and broken. No inscription bore their names, yet the story was clear: a ruler who mistook love for salvation, and a woman who mistook power for freedom. Together, they forged an empire from desire, and burned it upon the altar of their obsession. In time, the people forgot their crimes. Only the legend remained. And those who walked among the ruins of the old palace spoke of a strange feeling there, as if the air itself held its breath, still haunted by what it had seen. Some swore that when the sun set over the Bosporus, one could hear faint music echoing through the stones, the echo of a love that defied God and empire alike. A love that built a kingdom and left behind only dust.